Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be jumping into something pretty heavy
Yeah, we're going back to 17th century New England.
to uncover how basically the memories of war. I mean, that's kind of a crazy thing to think about, how memories can shape the world.
Well, they do. They shape the landscapes that we know today, and we're talking about King Philip's War.
Yeah, and so this is a conflict that, just radically transformed the Northeast.
But it's often overlooked in history books.
Yeah, it's one of those kind of forgotten wars, but so impactful. And I think what's so interesting about this is, we think about history as dates and battles, but we're diving into something a little bit deeper here.
Yeah. I mean, how are the memories of this war? Like, how are they embedded in the land itself?
Right.
And how have different groups used those memories
Both native and colonial.
to shape their understanding of the past?
It's fascinating to think that something that happened centuries ago is
Unfulfilled.
still,
Yeah.
resonating in the present day.
Absolutely.
And the source material that we have for this deep dive is a great example of that.
It is.
We've got stories about specific locations
Yes, specific events.
that offer these incredible glimpses into how the past continues to resonate in our lives.
Yeah.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's head to Deer Island in Boston Harbor. Now, I have to admit,
Okay.
when I first heard we were going to talk about Deer Island, I pictured, well, deer.
Right.
But this place has a much richer and, I would say, darker history than I ever imagined.
It does. Deer Island is a perfect example of what we call a memoryscape. So it's not just a physical place.
Okay.
It's a place layered with memories,
Okay.
some visible, some hidden.
Right.
And understanding those layers is essential to understanding how the past shapes the present.
So what kind of memories are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, during King Philip's War, Deer Island was used as a place of confinement for Native people who were forcibly removed from their homes.
Oh, wow.
So imagine being torn from your land and your community and forced onto this isolated island
Right.
in the middle of a harsh winter.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And to think that now it's mainly known for its wastewater treatment plant.
Yeah, wastewater treatment.
It's almost like
Yeah.
we've tried to erase those painful memories
Right.
by covering them up with something else.
It's a powerful example of how we choose to remember and forget certain aspects of the past.
Right.
And those choices have consequences. For example, in 2003, there was this controversy
Oh, yeah?
over allowing dog walking on Deer Island.
Yeah.
And Native groups argued that it was disrespectful because the island is believed to be a burial ground.
That's right. And that debate sparked a larger conversation
It did.
about the sacredness of Indigenous burial sites,
Yeah.
even when those sites are hidden beneath layers of modern development.
This controversy wasn't just about dogs. It was about whose memories matter.
Right.
And it really brought to light this ongoing struggle over recognizing and respecting Indigenous history, even in places where it's been deliberately obscured.
So we've seen how Deer Island holds these layers of memory, but what about a place like Boston itself?
Right.
I mean, it's a modern city
Yeah.
filled with skyscrapers and bustling streets.
Yeah.
How can we even begin to uncover
Well,
the hidden memories there?
it's fascinating because even in a place as seemingly modern as Boston,
Right.
the echoes of the past are all around us.
Oh.
Take, for example, the arrival of the Arbella in 1630, carrying John Winthrop and his Puritan followers.
Right.
Their arrival is often celebrated as the founding of Boston, but it's crucial to remember that they weren't landing on an empty shore.
Of course, there were already vibrant Indigenous communities
Exactly.
living in the area.
Communities like the Mishahom, who had been living along the Mystic River for generations.
Right.
The arrival of the Arbella marked the beginning of a process of land transformation and displacement,
Right.
the consequences of which are still felt today.
When you think about it that way, even something as simple as a street name can become a powerful symbol of colonial power.
Absolutely. The very act of renaming a place, of imposing a new language and a new history on the landscape,
Yeah.
is a form of what we call toponymic colonialism.
Wow.
It's a way of erasing Indigenous presence and asserting control over both space and memory.
That term, toponymic colonialism, it's so striking.
Yeah.
It really captures the idea that colonialism isn't just about physical conquest.
Right.
It's about controlling how we understand and remember the past.
Precisely. And we see this playing out in a variety of ways throughout the history of the Northeast.
So we've got Deer Island, a place of confinement transformed into a symbol of modern sanitation.
Right.
We've got Boston itself, built on land that was already home to thriving Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Let's delve into a specific example of cultural exchange and how it intersects with the dynamics of power during this period.
I'm intrigued.
Let's talk about the Eliot Bible. This was the first Bible printed in the English colonies. And what makes it so remarkable is that it was translated into an indigenous language.
Wow, I had no idea.
This project involved collaboration between colonial missionaries and native translators, like wow-wows, who played a crucial role in making the Bible accessible to indigenous communities.
That sounds like a genuine effort at cross-cultural understanding.
On the surface, perhaps.
Okay.
But it's essential to understand the complexities at play here.
Oh.
While the Eliot Bible did facilitate communication and knowledge sharing,
Right.
it was also part of a broader colonial project aimed at converting Native people to Christianity.
So this seemingly positive act of translation was also intertwined with the power dynamics of colonialism.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even acts of cultural exchange can be fraught with tensions and competing agendas.
This makes me think about the establishment of Harvard College and its short-lived Indian College in the mid-17th century.
You're making a great connection there. On the surface, these educational initiatives might appear well-intentioned,
Right.
aimed at providing Native students with access to European knowledge and education.
But I'm guessing there's more to the story.
Absolutely. While some Native communities saw value in engaging with European education, these initiatives were also part of a larger colonial project of assimilation.
Okay.
Colonial authorities believed that by educating Native students in European ways,
Right.
they could ultimately integrate them into colonial society.
So even education, something we often think of as positive and empowering, was used as a tool of control and assimilation.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of the complexities of this period and how seemingly well-intentioned acts can have unintended consequences.
It also highlights how the control of knowledge and information was central to the colonial project.
Right.
By shaping what was taught and how it was taught. Colonial authorities sought to influence the very way Native people understood the world.
This raises an important question.
Yeah.
How did Native communities resist these attempts to control their knowledge and their memories?
That's a question we'll explore more deeply as we continue our deep dive. So, one way that Native communities resisted these attempts to control their knowledge and their memories was through the power of oral tradition.
You know, it's incredible to think about how oral histories passed down through generations can preserve cultural memory.
Yeah.
In the face of such adversity.
It's a testament to the strength and resilience of Indigenous cultures. And it's important to recognize that these oral histories weren't just stories. They were living embodiments of knowledge, values, and beliefs.
So while colonial authorities were busy renaming places and rewriting history,
Yeah.
Native communities were keeping their own versions of the past alive.
Right. And those different versions of the past often clash,
Yeah.
leading to ongoing struggles over whose memories would be recognized and whose voices would be heard.
And we've talked a bit about Deer Island and Boston, but are there other places where these memory wars were particularly intense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Narragansett country, especially the area around Great Swamp in what is now Rhode Island,
Right.
became a focal point for both colonial and Indigenous memory. This area was strategically important for the Narragansett people. It offered refuge and resources, but it was also the site of one of the most devastating events of the war, the Great Swamp Massacre.
I remember reading about that. It was a brutal attack on a Narragansett winter encampment in December 1675.
Right. This event became etched in the memories of both sides, but for very different reasons.
Yeah.
For the colonists, it was a victory, a symbol of their power and dominance.
Right.
But for the Narragansett people, it was a tragedy, a symbol of the violence and dispossession they faced.
So how did these competing memories of the Great Swamp Massacre play out in the years that followed?
Well, one way we see this is through the construction of monuments. For example, there's a monument at Great Swamp that commemorates the battle from the colonial perspective.
Okay.
It emphasizes the colonial victory and reinforces the narrative of Native defeat.
That's interesting because it highlights how monuments themselves can become tools in the battle over memory.
Absolutely.
They're not just neutral markers of the past.
Right.
They're often imbued with specific interpretations and agendas.
Exactly. And it's important to contrast these colonial monuments with the less visible forms of remembrance practiced by Native communities.
Okay.
The Narragansett people kept the memory of the Great Swamp Massacre alive through oral traditions, ceremonies, and a deep connection to the land.
Right.
These forms of remembrance might not be as obvious as a stone monument, but they're no less powerful.
It makes you wonder how many other stories, how many other memories are hidden beneath the surface just waiting to be uncovered.
There are countless stories out there,
Right.
and each one adds another layer to our understanding of the past.
Yeah.
For example, we often hear about how colonial veterans were granted Narragansett townships as a reward for their service in the war.
Right. Those townships were basically carved out of native territory and given to the very people who had fought to dispossess them.
It's a stark reminder of how the memory of war was used to justify further colonization. And the act of renaming those places, of erasing the original indigenous names and replacing them with colonial ones, was another way of asserting control over both land and memory.
It's almost like they were trying to erase the Narragansett people from the map, both literally and figuratively.
It was a deliberate attempt to write the Narragansett people out of history, but the Narragansett people refused to be silenced. They continued to assert their presence, their claims to land, and their right to tell their own stories.
Do you have any specific examples of how they pushed back against these attempts at erasure?
Well, one fascinating example is the publication of the Narragansett Dawn in the early 20th century. This newspaper, run by the Narragansett people, provided a platform for their voices and perspectives.
That's so important because it gave them a way to challenge the dominant narratives that were being circulated in more mainstream publications.
Exactly. It allowed them to reclaim their history and tell their own stories on their own terms.
Right.
And it reminds us that history is never just one story.
Right.
There are always multiple perspectives, and it's essential to seek out those voices that have been marginalized or silenced.
This idea of multiple perspectives is crucial, especially when we start to think about the broader context of King Philip's War.
Yeah.
It wasn't just an isolated conflict in New England.
Right.
It was part of a much larger story that unfolded across the Atlantic world.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to the concept of the Red Atlantic.
Okay, tell me more about that. I've heard the term before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
The Red Atlantic refers to the vast network of exchange, forced migration, and cultural mixing that connected Native communities across the Atlantic world.
So it's not just about what happened in New England.
Right.
It's about recognizing the connections between Native communities in North America, Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean.
Exactly. And this network had a profound impact on the lives of Native people. We often focus on the wars and conflicts,
Right.
but the forced removal and enslavement of Native people were equally devastating.
It's a part of history that's often overlooked or downplayed,
Yeah.
but it's crucial to understand the full scope of the violence and exploitation that took place.
And it's essential to remember that this wasn't just a thing of the past. The legacies of these practices continue to shape our world today.
Okay, so we've got this network, the Red Atlantic, connecting people and cultures across vast distances. How does this tie back to the themes of memory and erasure we've been talking about?
Well, one of the most disturbing aspects of this history is the practice of capturing and selling Native people into slavery, both before and after King Philip's War.
Right.
This practice decimated Native populations, disrupted communities, and left lasting scars.
It's hard to even fathom the trauma and suffering endured by those who were captured and forced into slavery.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that the history of slavery in the Americas isn't just about the transatlantic slave trade. It's a much more complex and interconnected story.
Absolutely. And we see this complexity in the story of Indian John in Bermuda,
Okay.
who was executed and quartered in 1681 for allegedly plotting to kill his master. This brutal act of violence highlights the harsh realities of slavery and the racialized violence that permeated the colonial world.
It's a chilling reminder of the brutality of that system and the ways in which Native people were dehumanized and exploited.
And it challenges us to think about how those legacies of violence and oppression continue to shape our world today.
You know, we often hear about the children of enslaved Africans being sold away from their families, but we're always uncovering new layers, new connections, and new understandings. And it's our responsibility to keep searching for those hidden stories, to honor the memories of those who have been silenced, and to work towards a more just and equitable future.
And speaking of uncovering hidden stories, there's another fascinating piece of this puzzle that often gets overlooked. Remember we were talking about King Philip's son earlier?
Yes, the fact that he was captured and sent to Bermuda after the war.
Well, there's evidence to suggest that he may have been sold into slavery there.
Wow, I had no idea. That completely changes our understanding of what happened to him.
And it challenges the common narrative of complete Native erasure after King Philip's War.
Right.
It demonstrates that the history of Native people didn't end with the war. Their stories continued even in the most difficult and oppressive of circumstances.
It's a reminder that even in the face of tremendous adversity, Native people persevered.
Yeah.
They found ways to resist, to adapt, and to keep their cultures alive.
And those stories of resilience are just as important as the stories of violence and oppression. In fact, they're essential to understanding the full scope of Native history and experience.
Okay, so we've explored Deer Island, delved into the layered history of Boston, uncovered the complexities of the Red Atlantic, and witnessed the power of Native resistance. Where do we go from here on our journey through the memoryscapes of King Philip's War?
Yeah, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this conflict and its lasting impact on the landscape.
You're right, we have.
I mean, there must be so many other places where the memories of this war are still present, even if they're hidden from view.
Absolutely. Every corner of the Northeast holds traces of this conflict, even if those traces aren't always visible to the naked eye.
So where should we head next on our journey?
Let's travel along the Connecticut River,
Okay.
or as it was known to the indigenous peoples who lived along its banks, the Great River. This waterway was a lifeline for both native and colonial communities, but it also became a site of intense conflict during the war.
I can imagine the river itself becoming a kind of borderland
Exactly.
place where these different cultures.
These different ways of life collided.
Exactly. And one place along the river that holds particularly vivid memories of this clash is Peskamscut, the falls at what is now Turner's Falls, Massachusetts.
What happened there?
This site, a vital fishing ground for Native people for centuries, became the site of an ambush in 1676. A group of colonial soldiers led by Captain William Turner was attacked by a force of Nipmuc, Puckumtuck, and Wampanoag warriors.
It sounds like a scene straight out of a movie.
The battle was fierce, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. Captain Turner himself was killed, and the event became known as the Falls Fight, or Turner's Falls.
So this event must have sent shockwaves through the colonial settlements.
It did, and in the years that followed, the memory of the Falls Fight was used to justify further violence against Native communities. It reinforced the colonial narrative of indigenous people as savage and bloodthirsty enemies.
It's a classic example of how selective memory can be used to perpetuate stereotypes and justify oppression.
Exactly, and it's crucial to remember that these events didn't happen in a vacuum. Native communities were fighting for their survival, for their land, for their way of life.
Right.
To simply label them as aggressors is to ignore the complex historical context that led to this conflict.
So how can we ensure that we're not falling into that trap of perpetuating those harmful narratives?
It's essential to engage with multiple perspectives, to seek out the voices that have been silenced or marginalized.
Right.
And in the case of the Falls Fight, that means understanding the perspectives of the Nipmuc, Puckumtuck, and Wampanoag people who were defending their homelands.
Are there any efforts underway to reclaim those indigenous perspectives at Turner's Falls?
Absolutely. There are groups like the Friends of Wissatanwag, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the cultural and historical heritage of the Nipmuc people. They're working to reclaim indigenous toponyms, protect sacred sites, and ensure that Native voices are included in the telling of history.
That's so encouraging to hear. It's a reminder that history is not static. It's an ongoing process of discovery, interpretation, and reinterpretation. And as we continue to grapple with the legacies of colonialism, it's crucial to center the voices and experiences of those who have been most impacted by these systems of oppression.
You know, another site along the Connecticut River that holds a powerful, albeit tragic memory of King Philip's War is Bloody Brook.
Okay.
This site, located in what is now South Deerfield, Massachusetts, was the scene of another ambush in 1675.
Bloody Brook. I vaguely remember reading about that in school, but I don't recall many details.
A colonial militia escorting a wagon train carrying harvested grain was attacked by a force of Pocumtuck warriors. The attack was swift and devastating, and dozens of colonists were killed.
I can see why it became known as Bloody Brook.
The name itself is a stark reminder of the violence that took place there. And like the Falls Fight, the memory of Bloody Brook became deeply ingrained in the colonial imagination, reinforcing fears of indigenous violence and justifying further aggression.
Is there a monument at Bloody Brook, too?
Yes, a monument was erected in the 19th century to commemorate the event. But like many monuments from that era, it tells only one side of the story. It focuses on the colonial losses and portrays the Pocumtuck warriors as ruthless savages.
It's frustrating to think about how these monuments, often intended to preserve history, can actually perpetuate harmful stereotypes and erase the experiences of those who have been marginalized.
It's a reminder that we always need to be critical of the stories we're told about the past. We need to ask ourselves, who's telling the story? What perspectives are being represented and what voices are being silenced?
It's like we've been talking about throughout this entire deep dive. It's not just about remembering, it's about understanding, and it's about justice.
And that's the beauty of engaging with history. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to question our assumptions, and to work towards a more just and equitable future.
So as we wrap up our exploration of the memoryscapes of King Philip's War, what final thought would you leave our listeners with?
I'd encourage everyone to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep listening. The past is all around us, hidden in plain sight. And by uncovering those hidden stories, by engaging with multiple perspectives, and by honoring the memories of those who have been silenced, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, our communities, and the world we live in.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. But the conversation doesn't end here. I encourage all of you to continue exploring the history of King Philip's War and to consider how the memories of this conflict continue to shape the landscapes and communities we know today.